Isn't autumn such an amazing time? At least if you live in a place that actually has autumn. But if you don't, you can just imagine that you're seeing orange and yellow leaves gently falling down as you stroll. But don't stay out too late, or else you might come across cats that start talking for some reason, sewer clowns, or vampires. For most people, the risk of vampires being out at night might get them to stay inside, but for some, they'll want to come see for themselves, to say the least. Similarly to mermaids and witches, vampires are mythological figures that started off as scary and threatening, and they're still seen that way, but with a certain bite. I'm not sure if this is still a thing, but in, say 2014, there was about 5 million Wattpad stories where the cover is some faceless guy in a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and the tags will say something about a vampire. I couldn't help but wonder, how did we get from something like Nosferatu to the Vampire Diaries? For the sake of YouTube friendliness, every time I say pomegranate in this video, just know I don't mean the fruit. I mean the red stuff. The B word. You get it. We're all on the same page. This might be the sauciest video I've ever made, so get ready. If you're over the age of 21, get your glass of wine, nightdress, and prepare to be bitten, playfully. We're gonna look into how vampires went from monsters of the night to romantic forbidden lovers. So now, let's get started. Tales of pomegranate drinking vampires have existed since ancient times. Ancient Persia, especially, is one of the first civilizations to tell myths of these type of demons. Greco-Roman mythology describes Impusa, daughter of goddess Hecate, as a demon who looks like a young woman so she can have men's pomegranate. Lilith, who in some cultures was said to be the first wife of Adam before Eve, left him to become queen of demons and enjoyed a steady diet of pomegranate. Oupires are demonic demons from Eastern European folklore, who are now known as the prototype of vampires, specifically corpses who leave their graves to torment the living. And they kind of made their way outside of mythology. The 11th century saw the first reports of not alive people leaving their graves, with no sign of decay. Certain interpretations began to take shape. They were out of their grave for a reason. They want to torment the living, and they want their pomegranate. Vampires were described as figures who are not only not alive and living, but as minions of Satan. Typically, they ended up that way because they sinned nonstop throughout their living days. Their appearance was also described as being demon-like. In the medieval times, vampires appeared bloated, with very long nails, and large, wide, unblinking eyes. Their terrifying appearance heightened the fear surrounding them, especially in times of crisis. During epidemics like the plague, with all the questionable medical practices used to solve the issue, which only made it worse, demons and vampires were commonly blamed for the disease. People were terrified of contagion, so anyone who passed away were quickly buried, and in some cases, people were buried when they were still alive. During the 1600s, Jerry Grando was the first recorded person to be deemed a vampire. These rumors circulated after he passed away, but claimed that he rose from his grave at nightfall, drank the pomegranate of villagers, and acted inappropriately to his widow. There was also an urban legend in that town where he would knock on people's doors, and whoever's door was knocked, they would pass away in a matter of days. I'm gonna guess that people guarded their doors at night, maybe with taping pillows onto it. After this, there's a focus on Peter Balagojevic, who lived his life as a peasant. After his burial, rumors were spreading that he had returned from the grave as a vampire, rising at night to haunt the living. This theory was believed at the time because, allegedly, in his coffin, he was still growing hair, a beard, and showed no signs of decomposing. Legends say that he even perished his own son after he refused to give him food. To put an end to this hysteria, villagers drove a stake through what used to be his heart. Near identical cases happened with Milo Cesar and Arnold Powell. I'm sure there were a few others, culminating to what was known as the 18th century vampire controversy. This point of history was considered the Age of Enlightenment and early development of modern science. In some circles, folkloric superstitions were beginning to lose the influence they once had, but because not everything can be explained, people often turned to old beliefs for answers. Vampires were a way to explain the unexplainable. An issue of Le Mercure Galant, a French magazine for nobles, even did a report on the vampires of Eastern Europe. Treatises on the apparitions of spirits and on vampires analyzed the various cases of supposed real-life vampires. While it didn't fully endorse the vampire theory, it still opened doors to the possibility of them existing. Poet Heinrich August Offenfelder wrote The Vampire, using vampirism as a metaphor for his lust for a young woman who rejects his advances, clinging to her traditional and religious values. This is not a love poem, it's about control. But this is one of the earliest examples of vampires being associated with desire. Vampire panic started to come to an end in the 1750s. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who, in the middle of yelling at her daughter Marie Antoinette through letters, sent her personal physician, Gerhard van Swieten, to investigate the vampire reports. After examining the cases, van Swieten concluded that vampires didn't exist, which resulted in Empress Theresa passing a law against opening graves. While the fear of vampires went away, they still had an air of allure. There was something ancient and mystical about these creatures, beings of the past who haunted people living in a rapidly changing world. So something interesting happened in 1816. A group of legendary writers, including Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and John William Polidori, did a contest on who can write the scariest story. Mary Shelley would write Frankenstein, a modern take on the Prometheus myth, and Polidori would write The Vampire, with a Y. The early 19th century was the height of the Romanticism movement, and while making a romantic story about vampires seemed bizarre for the time, a closer look at vampire lore reveals that it was a natural fit. In The Vampire, Aubrey is a man fascinated by the self-absorbed Lord Ruthven. He had a strange and unusual aura that you can't really explain, but is still irresistible to everyone, especially for the more bashful girls. Aubrey's wife is found not alive, covered in bite marks, and later, Ruthven is attacked by bandits. While on his dramatic, gothic, passing away bed, he asks Aubrey to promise to not say anything about him for a year. But to Aubrey's horror, he mysteriously returns to London, seductively waving his way through society, this time courting Aubrey's sister. When Aubrey finally tries to warn her about Ruthven, it's too late. He finds her long gone, completely drained of her pomegranate. John Capek writes, in Polidorian context, Ruthven's success in Polidori's tale reveals the landscape of modern, increasingly capitalistic class society to be laden with anxiety concerning the continuing power of the aristocracy, as though untouched by the social shifts in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Ruthven was arguably the first depiction of the Byronic vampire, which is modeled after the Byronic hero, a moody, cynical guy who is still capable of love. Ruthven was said to be inspired by Lord Byron. He was a really brooding guy, but people were drawn to him because they knew he was dangerous. And romantic literature of this time just loved unreadable, emotionally unavailable guys, and Ruthven fit that image perfectly. He was by no means a romantic interest, but he was still suave and charismatic. He was able to get what he wanted, and everyone would happily oblige. Vampires weren't described as attractive at the time, so desiring them was an extra layer of taboo. The story revolutionized vampire fiction and how they are portrayed. They're no longer just monsters living under graves, but can live amongst even the highest of societies. In the 1840s, a serialized gothic horror story, Varney the Vampire, introduced vampires with fangs. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. But Varney still has some humanity left in him. He can't help being a vampire. He never asked to have hypnotic powers and superhuman strength that could come handy in many situations. As Gothic literature enjoyed a comeback in the late Victorian era, vampires re-emerged as powerful symbols of the era's repressed fears, desires, and anxieties. One of the most famous and influential examples was Carmilla. Laura is a young woman who meets the mysterious and unusual Carmilla. She sleeps during the day, steps far away from crosses, and is vague about her past and where she comes from. It turns out that Carmilla is a pomegranate-drinking vampire, whose dark influence over Laura is ended by a vampire hunter. The spell is now broken. Though Carmilla is set in the 17th century, the themes still match the Victorian era's structure of respectability and social appearance. Laura's reserved nature contrasts with Carmilla's seductive freedom, hinting at an eternal struggle with suppressed desires and identity. There was stuff about holding hands with fond pressures, gloating eyes, and her mouth traveling, you get it. But the story and themes would inspire the most famous vampire novel yet. Bram Stoker's Dracula is written with unreliable narration with no specific protagonist. Described through a series of journal entries, newspaper articles, and other documents, Jonathan travels to Transylvania to help Count Dracula purchase property in England. While the Count appears to be a courteous aristocrat, there's something off about him. He lives in a weird, cobweb-filled medieval castle, never eats or drinks, but insists that Jonathan does, and he has no reflection in mirrors. Of course, this old-world nobleman is a vampire, and he and his 3 wives are out to get Jonathan. After arriving to England, the Count bites the coquettish Lucy, and the more morally upright Mina, whom he creates a psychic link with. With the help of Mina, the Count gets deleted by everyone he wronged and crumbles to dust before sunset. Similarly, in The Vampire and Carmilla, Dracula evokes a corrupting type of seduction, but his allure wasn't based on charm alone. He controls his quote-unquote brides and victims through hypnotic influence. His conquests are far from romantic. Appearance-wise, he was described to be unnaturally pale, with a large mustache, very sharp teeth, bad breath, hairy palms, and glowing eyes. I've seen Tumblr drool over worse. He still wasn't written as hideous or anything, but more unnervingly powerful. For one, there's a thing about vampires and biting. The neck is sensitive, and the fangs enter the skin. You get what I mean? But while these characters have their metaphorical sexual awakening by Dracula, it was showcased as scary and unnatural, far from the modest, passive, Victorian model. This novel was released in 1897. In that same year, there was The Pomegranate of the Vampire, which focuses on a biracial/Creole woman who is a vampire. But you can tell the author does not get that experience. And then came cinema. The subject of copyright law wasn't super understood, which might be why the 1922 German expressionist film Nosferatu is sort of an unauthorized adaptation of the novel Dracula. Thomas is a real estate agent who travels to Transylvania where he meets a mysterious nobleman, Count Orlok. He has long fingernails, a bald head, pointed ears, and long, sharp teeth. He resembles a bat, and that's not me judging him. A character from the novel, The Golem, inspired how he'd look. Thomas suspects that this guy might be a vampire, while Orlok is interested in Thomas's wife, Ellen. Like, he gets obsessed with her. After causing a plague in town, he can only be defeated if she gives herself to him, distracting him until the sun rises. As a result of this, they both pass away. Count Orlok is a complex character. He's the incarnation of evil, one of Satan's archdemons. He has rats pouring onto streets, recreating the plague. But he's also drawn to Ellen, who is kind and self-sacrificing. There's so many layers to that. Like, she's so perfect in every way and will willingly hurt herself to save others. Ellen's quiet kindness and selflessness sharply contrast with Orlok's inhuman horror, highlighting the tension between compassion and corruption. With Orlok's demon-like appearance and his stiff movements, he seems like a ghoul, something to run away from. You would have no idea that he is an aristocrat, but he already has the status. He doesn't care about impressing anyone. But many audiences were disturbed by him. In 1931's Dracula, the exact same thing was there, but very different. Similarly to the novel, the character Dracula is very refined and formal. He wears a tuxedo with a cape, even in places he doesn't need to. He fully embodies the image of an aristocrat. That is, until he gets the chance to drink pomegranate and is asked why he doesn't have a reflection. Despite being the villain, he's incredibly charismatic in that hypnotic, slow-speaking, stare-into-your-soul type of way. All he has to do is make commands, and they are followed. And of course, the biting situation. While this movie was foremost intended to be scary, there still wasn't a shortage of audience-goers who picked up on the subtext. They'd see the Count saying, "Come here," and they were thinking, I don't care what he says, as long as he says it in that accent. Bela Lugosi got so much fan mail from this movie. He got more than Rhett Butler at one point. This version of Dracula did a lot for the vampire fantasy, helping to define vampires as figures that blended sophisticated calmness with hypnotic danger. The 1958 British version of Dracula evoked these same sensibilities, but added to the vampire lore. Christopher Flaling explains, Dracula introduced fangs, décolletage, ready-prepared wooden stakes. This was also the first vampire movie shot in color, so everything was more in your face. This Dracula was thirsty, and so were the viewers. Tim Stanley wrote, Lee's sensuality was subversive, in that it hinted that women might quite like having their neck chewed on by a stud. When the characters Mina and Lucy are about to be bitten by Dracula, they appear to be openly into him. In one alternative scene with Mina, they almost kiss before he bites. This is a more deliberate portrayal of vampires causing actual awakenings. Plus, this is a British film, so they had the freedom of not having to follow the Hays Code. It could be a little bolder with the spicy tension. And during the 60s and 70s in British horror, there was a subgenre of vampire films that feature a demure female protagonist being seduced and bitten by a vampire who happens to be a woman, showing that might be kind of groundbreaking for cinema at the time. But in reality, like 90% of these films are made by guys for guys. Going back to the literature world, as quick and cheaper made paperbacks were flourishing, publishers like Mills and Boon became known for producing tame, formulaic romance novels aimed primarily at a female audience. 1972's The Flame and the Flower by Kathleen E. Woodwis changed the game by writing explicit spicy scenes. The plot was basically, I was purchased by One Direction without One Direction. Vampires would quickly become a subject of desire in these types of works, further emphasizing the image of vampires as romantic, or at least lustful. While not explicitly romantic, Anne Rice's interview with the vampire takes to 18th century colonial Louisiana. Lestat is a vampire who bites Louise, but only for his money. Louise struggles living the vampire life. He doesn't like having to drink other people's pomegranate, unlike Lestat, who is just loving it. Being a vampire is hard. The only way you can survive is by biting other people. He's soulful, and the reader can feel that. It culminates with the shameless Lestat being defeated, but we'll be getting back to them. The Lost Boys in 1987 showed vampires in a way that hasn't been shown before. They weren't from a different place or time. They were younger, more modern, or at least encapsulated the 80s hair metal essence. This showcased that vampires weren't only aristocrats draped in cloaks walking around castles. They were those really mean guys you see on merry-go-rounds. They also embraced party culture, echoing the older vampire legends that portrayed them as unstoppable savage monsters, which is the type of people you might see in the wild party world. While with the vampire characters, there wasn't any straightforward romance in this film, these vampires leaned into the younger, dangerous heartthrob type, which would be influential for future vampire characters. But with the release of this movie and 1992's Dracula, which this time was more emotional and romantic, vampires were back. There was even a movie called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I wonder what that's about. Blade was an action vampire. Vampire in Brooklyn centered on identity issues, being caught in between humanity and vampirism, where humanity wins in the end. Vampires are exciting, and it's a thrilling life to live, but it's a dangerous world that needs to be slayed. This timely micro-trend of vampires could be attributed to Gen X philosophy centering rebellion and nihilism, as well as the increasing visibility of goth culture, especially propped by the 1994 horror film The Crow. And most frighteningly, this was the era of the HIV/AIDS panic. People were terrified of disease, unsafe intimacy. Vampires became the ultimate forbidden fruit, and an emotional vessel for eternal longing. The emotional tragic vampire was shown again in the film adaptation of Interview with a Vampire. This movie was kind of faithful to the novel, but kind of not, and took some inspiration from Francis Coppola's Dracula. Director Neil Jordan says, "It would be really great to expand on that epic sense of darkness, and to give these characters huge, kind of romantic destinies, and longings and feelings. That vision is reflected clearly in how the characters are reimagined. For one, Lestat is less cruel and monstrous, but more darkly charming, and Movie Lewis isn't as philosophically tortured as he is brooding and withdrawn. Also, this movie stars 90s Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. I think the casting directors knew what they were doing. They've got the puffy shirt and everything. Also, real-life Tom Cruise was brunette, and Brad Pitt was blonde, but in this movie, this was reversed. I guess they wanted to show their versatility. Which vibe do you like better? Do you like the cynical but passionate Louis, who feels pain with being a vampire? Or the enigmatic Lestat, who loves the pomegranate drinking life and is openly seductive? He may seem like he's really into a girl, and she's just like, oh my god, he's into me. But it's also he can drink her pomegranate. He's also arrogant and kind of insecure, like he's super controlling because he doesn't want to be alone. And he's just fueled by drama, or pick the other one. He might be moody, but at least he won't shamelessly drink pomegranate. There's a reason Lestat was the vampire that was demised at the end. However, Lestat returns in Queen of the Damned as a rock star guy. He's really famous, and no one knows that he's a vampire. But initially, he was the type who liked to live in the shadows and be mysterious and stuff, so why does he want to be a celebrity? And in leather pants and a leather jacket with no shirt. That doesn't sound comfy. But the opposite personality, vampire dynamic, was also shown in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. The show centers on the Chosen One narrative, where Buffy has to battle against vampires and other dark creatures. The typical structure of each episode shows the evil vampire or scary thing of the week. Buffy saves the day and everything is okay for the next few days in somewhere Southern California. But her arch nemesis is a Draco-looking vampire dude, Spike. He's a tough, sarcastic, untamable guy who has no respect for rules, at least until he starts becoming obsessed with Buffy. Since he's the villain that keeps returning, he'd see her strength, resilience, and development as a character, and this motivates him to become a better man for her. He may have put a rough demeanor at the start, but he has a secret soft side. He even sacrifices himself to save the world at the end of the series. But he'd be resurrected in the spin-off show, Angel. In Buffy, Angel is another vampire who's more serious and reserved. He also loves Buffy. If you become a vampire slayer, prepare for a bunch of vampires to be into you. Buffy and Angel love each other, but being together will destroy them both. His soul is cursed. If he experiences a moment of true happiness, he loses it and becomes Angelus, a sadistic vampire. But in a mysterious way, Spike was the standout amongst the show's fans. A character arc of a dangerous pomegranate-drinking vampire who's mean to everyone but the main character and falls in love with her and decides to change for the better because he's so in love. I just can't say why audiences might start writing fan fictions. Now, this video is mostly centered on guy vampires. While women vampires don't have as much visibility, when they are shown, they're like flawless. They sort of take on the succubus or siren mythologies a bit. Yeah, vampires in general just have a lot of charms. By this point, there was so many depictions of vampires as the ultimate exciting danger, you forget at one point that they are an intrinsic threat. But that's the whole appeal. Because they're already not alive and have nothing to lose, they're confident, fearless, and seductive in a way that feels untouchable. The danger is exactly what makes them so hard to resist. While vampires may seem like the ultimate dream, this concept was subverted in the show True Pomegranate. A telepathic human woman comes face to face with a group of vampires. In the middle of unhealthy, manipulative relationships, they have their own governments and hierarchies. And if you're human, you're just seen as lesser than. Vampires were about to be more culturally dominant than they had been in years. In 2005, Stephenie Meyer released her debut novel, Twilight, which was a New York Times bestseller. Every book claims to be a New York Times bestseller, but this really was a notable title in the young adult fiction world. Bella Swan is 17 and moves with her dad to the small, foggy town of Forks, Washington. At school, she notices a wealthy, mysterious, isolated family who happens to be breathtakingly, celestially beautiful, especially Edward. He stares at her weirdly and develops an obsession with her because he's interested in her pomegranate. He and his family are vegetarian vampires, so they don't drink that. But there's something about Bella that really intrigues him. She discovers that he's a vampire, and they enjoy a chaste, forbidden love. There's some issues with nomadic vampires, and later in the series, there's an introduction to werewolf characters. Twilight was adapted to a movie, and it made over 11 times its budget. Edward Cullen became the ultimate fantasy boyfriend. He's protective. He saves Bella from danger several times. He watches over her, even when she sleeps. He's a brooding, tortured soul who only has eyes for one girl, for no specific reason. We know he likes the smell of her pomegranate, but it just happens to be that way. She's more tempting than any human he's ever met, and when she wore that ankle-length khaki skirt in the novel, woof. But still, he doesn't have a wandering eye, and isn't presented as particularly lustful. His desire is so tightly controlled, it becomes almost moral. He constantly reins himself in, framing intimacy as something sacred and dangerous, not just primal. And I would say he had the in-name danger and forbiddenness of being a vampire without having to be a vampire. Aside from Jasper, the Cullens don't lose control. They're refined and know how to contain their secret. What makes Edward different is that under the sunlight, he sparkles. I never got the thing of Edward trying to expose his vampireness in New Moon. Like, wouldn't he just look like he covered himself in body glitter? The sparkle thing got so much flack. People were like, he doesn't even turn to dust under sunlight. When not all vampires demise under the sun. The novel version of Dracula could survive in the sun. His powers just weren't effective. But I doubt the typical 2009-era Twilight hater wasn't too studious on vampire mythology. Going back to New Moon, this started the famous love triangle. Edward loves Bella so much, he leaves her. He goes to Europe to work as a model or something. But Bella has to choose between him or a werewolf that takes off his shirt every 5 minutes. It's in his contract to do so. In this time, you were either Team Edward or Team Jacob. I remember that being discussed a lot in class. Aside from one other girl, I was the only one I knew who was on Team Jacob. I just didn't like Edward, something about him threw me off. But Jacob turned out to be weird later on in the story. But Edward isn't much better. Aside from the sleeping thing, if he's like 100, why is he still in high school? And I get the romance here isn't the best. There's an entire laundry list of why Edward and Bella isn't a good example of a healthy relationship. I mean, it is about a vampire. But this love story still isn't a world of a difference from other romantic narratives that doesn't get half of the discussions. And the Bella Swan is a bad role model thing just always annoyed me. Like, she's a character in a story. She doesn't need to be a role model for anything. As successful as the Twilight series was, its most notable critic was Robert Pattinson, who had a public image where you could easily believe him as a vampire. He had a very anti-authority bad boy persona. He didn't care about looking PR ready. He openly didn't like Twilight and critiqued Stephenie Meyer. And yet, almost no one called him ungrateful. And on a Tyra Show interview, he actually bit her neck. He left a mark and everything. The series about vampires was game-changing for the youth-centered market. I remember it having a rivalry with Harry Potter, even though these two are very different stories. And Harry Potter eventually used Twilight-esque imagery in its adverts. There was a lot of marketing of a love triangle in the Hunger Games. And we saw young adult novel adaptations with a dark, brooding romance story everywhere. This happened with Beastly, Red Riding Hood, Beautiful Creatures, The Mortal Instruments, City of Bones. We can critique Twilight all day, but its impact on culture of the time was undeniable. There was the parody film Vampires Suck. I thought this movie was just the height of comedy, and I feel like it was tailor-made for vampire fans and haters. This is the best coming together moment. The fear that wants to find them took a backseat to longing stares and marriage in some cases. During the CW's peak era, they just had to do something about this. I remember when The Vampire Diaries was coming out, I thought it was just a show trying to cash in on the Twilight trend, but it was a book series that started in 1991. Teen Wolfmore did that for the Jacob fans. But anyways, a small town has a history of supernaturalness, and every girl, Alina Gilbert, meets a mysterious new student, Stefan, and his brother, Damon, who both happen to be vampires. For the first few seasons, the plot is centered on a love triangle between her and these two pomegranate fans. Taking from the Interview with a Vampire model, Stefan is the romantic, morally conflicted one. He doesn't want to be a monster, but beneath all that restraint is a darker persona, one that's violent, sadistic, and disturbingly into pomegranate like it's fine wine. But he's still not much of a goody-goody. He's got enough brooding edge to keep things interesting. Damon, on the other hand, is a sarcastic anti-hero who is shamelessly a vampire and a shameless flirt. He smirks like his life depends on it. His name is Damon, which sounds like Damien, which is associated with the devil, and vampires like the devil's minions, yeah. But of course, as the show progresses, we see more of his sensitive side, and his roguish ways start to mellow. The Vampire Diaries leans heavily into the idea that love can be both a saving grace and a destructive force, depending on what you do with it. There's other characters in the show, including werewolves and witches. Bonnie is a witch, and well, I've seen at most 4 episodes of the show, but I've heard rumors that Bonnie was really done dirty by the writers, and behind the scenes, Kat Graham has been through stuff, and the fans were being a mess. Sigh. And vampire media just continues to take off. Sometimes they're scary, but most of the time, they're alluring. The series Hemlock Grove focuses on a rich, ancient vampire family, when technically they're au pairs. Roman is a stereotypical rich jerk, but he's intimately insatiable and loves the taste of pomegranate. Eventually, he's deeply conflicted and emotionally damaged, especially as he comes to grips with his identity. There was also the movie and TV series Vampire Academy, which of course was based on the novel of the same name. The series adaptation of Interview with the Vampire is currently still running. And in the more scary traditional vampires, we have Sinners and the remake of Nosferatu. The "he's a beast but I still love him" thing is a story that's been around for centuries. We're still obsessed with it today. Vampires take that same blueprint. They're tortured. They're alone and isolated in the nightfall or wherever. Not many people understand them, but maybe the viewer, or at least an Every Girl stand-in character, can. But it all comes with a risk. It may seem riveting in a story, but in real life, danger and romance do not mesh. But nonetheless, vampires continue to captivate audiences because they reflect our deepest fears and desires, evolving with society to explore themes of immorality, identity, and the human condition. And that's all I have for the romantic evolution of vampires. Be sure to check out my Patreon, and thank you all for watching, and hope to see you all in the next one. Bye!